Man, we're going to talk about Chuck Berry today. I have been overdosing on Chuck all month, along with some Graham Parsons, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, as far as the research I've been doing and the movies I've been watching. Holy smokes. Have I got a lot to share with you, but I've also got a lot to filter through and, collate and mash into a presentable sort of delivery package for you. It's been an intense month, and like an idiot, I've waited till the end of it to really start committing to the recording of these episodes, even though I've been reading, watching movies, taking notes, and typing things up for weeks and weeks. Now, here where I live, we are experiencing record high temperatures, and I have no air conditioning. So I am sweating my skin off like a fool in my home, and I am doing this with the fan on and the lights off as much as possible. Got a million books in front of me with bookmarks in them to pull information from. I'm a little torn on which movie to start with. I think we'll just do separate episodes. What I'm going to focus on is Go Johnny Go, which was a black and white film that Chuck Berry starred in, supporting Mr. Alan Freed, who was sort of a supporting character, and they're both doing this sort of talent scout type thing. This, we're going to find the next big rock and roll star, and it's going to happen to be this fresh-faced white kid named Johnny. What is it? Johnny Melody is what they end up calling him. And it's really a little romance story about the main character Johnny and his old high school acquaintance, who he develops a romantic relationship and a singing and a music recording relationship with. But it's interesting because Chuck shows up in it a few times, pretends to play piano in one scene, has some witty lines here and there, some good jokes. But well, shoot, maybe we'll talk about that movie. Go Johnny Go. I'm already halfway through explaining what it is. It's interesting as a time capsule. And I say that because, Alan and Chuck are close enough as people in business to be doing this movie together about them being now the ones to foster the breakout success of another artist, another young artist. For anyone that doesn't know, and, if you're here listening to this, I should assume everyone doesn't know, but if I'm only recording this for the experts, I'm dead in the water anyway, because they're all going to know everything I'm about to say. So I don't know why I qualified that. They had a relationship from the very beginning through Leonard Chess at Chess Records. And the other movie we're going to talk about is Cadillac Records. I will get in depth on that, I suppose, in the other episode. I have a whole book about Chess Records to pull from. Boy, oh boy, do I have some opinions about that book and that author as it relates to Chuck Berry. Maybe I won't be able to help myself from crossing over. Maybe I'll just have to combine both movies into 2 long episodes, because there's a lot of stuff to talk about between Ed Ward's History of Rock and Roll, Chuck Berry's autobiography, The History of Chess Records by John Collis. It's just called Chess Records. And it's a good book. It's a great book, by the way. I'm not trashing the book. Then we've got Play It Loud by the former, or I guess probably still current editor of Guitar World magazine, Brad Tolinsky, as well as his writing partner, Alan DePerna, who I'm not familiar with, but I will probably check out and see whatever else he's done. This is a fantastic book. If you want to learn anything about the history of guitar music, holy smokes. It is such a great history of the electric guitar. Then we've got 45 RPM by Jim Dawson and Steve Probst. Now, I'm going to go into Leonard Chess, Alan Freed, and Chuck Berry and that little triangulation, and I'm going to read from multiple books that cover the same sort of moment in time. And I think it's worthwhile to pull from all this stuff, because it really does hammer home what an important event in the history of rock and roll it was, and how it was business as usual at the time and would become illegal later. I'm also going to talk about Rock and Roll, An Unruly History by Robert Palmer. No, not that Robert Palmer, but another one. And then a couple of good little short essays by a gentleman named Colin Escott. He wrote Hank Williams' biography. He wrote Good Rockin' Tonight, the Sun Records story. And he wrote a whole bunch of liner notes for various collections of music and albums. In this case, I'm going to read just a couple of his entries from the Loud, Fast, and Out of Control Rhino Records box set that I bought some 15 years ago, I think it was. It's a great collection of 50s rock and roll. If you want to find it, there are replicas on Spotify and YouTube Music right now of this track listing, of this 4-disc set that, damn it, I've lost one of the discs from, and I'm very angry about that because this whole box set is on eBay for hundreds of dollars now, even in the digital age. If you want a really fantastic breakdown of great rock and roll music that skips over the namby-pamby stuff and a lot of the teen singing group stuff and a lot of the cliches, a lot of the boring stuff that didn't have any good guitars on them or good horn solos on them, look up Loud, Fast, and Out of Control, The Wild Sounds of 50s Rock from Rhino Records, and just find this a Spotify playlist someone's put together. It's awesome. So much good stuff. It's not all deep cuts. It's a lot of deep cuts you've never heard, but it still does have Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, Roy Orbison, the Everly Brothers, things like that. But you get like Hand Clapping by Red Prysock. You get Flip, Flop, and Fly by Joe Turner and his Blues Kings. You get the Hippie Hippie Shake by Chan Romero. You get Harlem Nocturne by the Viscounts, the version that was used in Stephen King and John Carpenter's Christine. Oh, it's so good. School of Rock and Roll by Gene Summers. You also get Screaming Jay Hawkins doing Little Demon. You get Race with the Devil by Gene Vincent. I mean, all kinds of cool stuff. Anyway, that was a bit of a side quest. Let me start with his liner notes on 2 Chuck Berry songs. 1, Roll Over Beethoven. Genius is an overused word, especially in rock music, but Chuck Berry is a genius. A 30-year-old R&B musician. He could sit in what were still called, quote-unquote, colored hotels with his guitar and become a pimply white suburban teenager. He was writing for kids who had known nothing but post-war optimism while he was a child of the Depression. He saw the insecurity beneath the bravado, but portrayed it affectionately and uncondescendingly. Roll Over Beethoven is the new world order pushing the old aside. Chuck even gave the new music its own lexicon, dotted with phrases like rockin' pneumonia and a shot of rhythm and blues, both of which, incidentally, would become titles of hit songs. That is a point that is impossible to understate. His contribution to the language of rock and roll on the guitar fretboard and in the lyrics, especially the awesome words he made up, like coolerator and motivating. The coolerator was filled with TV dinners and ginger ale, as heard in You Never Can Tell. That one got me when I saw Pulp Fiction in high school. Had to get the soundtrack, then had to buy some Chuck Berry after that. But of course, if I'm going to be clear about my biases, I first heard Johnny B. Good in '85 when Back to the Future came out. And it was ridiculous because like I'm sorry, everybody. The whole movie, Marty McFly's talking like this. And even though he talks like this, he's still cool somehow. But Doc, what are we going to do? And then he picks up a guitar and he starts playing the intro licks, the blues riff and B for Johnny B. Good. And all of a sudden, we're down in Louisiana, crossing New Orleans. Oh, back up in the woods. I had that soundtrack and I listened to it all the time. That still threw me. I was like, that's not Michael J. Fox. Who the hell? And it's not Chuck Berry. So what are we doing? What is the point? Anyway, let me finish up what this Roll Over Beethoven section says. Within 15 years, groups would be filling entire sides of LPs with suites that said nothing. Here, in 2 minutes and 22 seconds, Chuck Berry gave us an anthem, a little poetry, and a 4-bar intro to die for. The same gentleman's notes on Johnny B. Good. Chuck Berry wrote little novellas, rich in detail, allegory, and economy. Most resolve themselves in less than 2.5 minutes. It doesn't take much reading between the lines to figure out that Johnny B. Good is Charles E. Berry. Quote, I guess my mother has as much right to be declared the source of Johnny B. Good as any other contender, Chuck later wrote. She repeatedly commented that I would be a millionaire someday. Chuck hid behind the name of his pianist, Johnny Johnson. So Johnny, comes from Johnny Johnson, whose band he sort of muscled his way into. We'll get to that in the Cosmo Club days in East St. Louis. And his birthplace on Good Street, St. Louis, Goode. So there we go. Johnny Good, there we are. The story begins near New Orleans because there had been a staging post quote, way back out in the woods, unquote, where slaves were bought and sold, excuse me. The story ends with the personal redemption. The kid's a star simply from playing guitar, quote, just like a ringing a bell, unquote. And that symbolism's important. In another movie we'll get to, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, a documentary concert film made in the 80s, he is very affectionate sort of about his memories of the theater in which they're going to perform the ending concert with all these rock stars backing him up. He talks about how not far away in the town square his forefathers were sold as property. He talks about how, when he was a child, he came to this box office of this same theater to buy tickets for a play. And I don't recall what it was, if it was Oklahoma. It was a musical, I believe, something like that. And he was refused by the adult ticket taker that said, you people aren't supposed to be here. And had to wait 3 years until the same exact play would come to a part of town that had a theater that he could actually go to and not get kicked out for being black. Now, since we're talking about Cadillac Records, the film, which chronicles the early history of Chess Records in Chicago in the early 1950s onward, let's go straight to Leonard Chess, founder of Chess Records, with his, I think it was Marshall. There was Marshall, Leonard, and I believe a Philip Chess, if I'm not mistaken. Another chess artist was Chuck Berry. This is taken straight from Chess Records by John Collis. This is not the part of the book that I'm going to be all cranky about. Leonard Chess recalled once, Berry came in with a wire recorder and played a country music takeoff called Ida Red. It had been turned down by Capitol and Mercury. We recut it in our little studio behind the office with two sidemen. Phil and I were the engineers. We called it Maybelline. I'm going to pause there. It's true, according to Chuck and other authors, Ida Red was a popular country song. And during his time working at this place called the Cosmopolitan, or the Cosmo Club in East St. Louis, he often did country material and repurposed it with his own lyrics. The origin of lots of his early compositions was just extending popular songs he would play for people to dance to and like creating new verses for them. So eventually he just takes the verses he wrote from scratch to someone else's rhythms and then writes a whole new song and uses those verses for his own tunes. Ida Red was not the kind of thing that they wanted to, put out as a cover song at Chess Records, so they just changed the name of the woman in it, and they used his lyrics instead of the original country lyrics. But it was important that this is a country music cross-pollination with rhythm and blues and soul. That's what Chuck was trying very consciously to do. While over at Sun Records, they were consciously looking for a white singer who sounded more like a rhythm and blues or soul singer, but would still be accepted on the regular white popular charts. Eventually they would find that in Elvis. They would try it. They would try to get close with some of their other artists, but they didn't try it. They didn't try to reshape someone like Jerry Lee Lewis or Roy Orbison or Johnny Cash to fit the mold. They tried to find it naturally, and they did with Elvis, and it paid off big time. The opposite's happening over at Chess Records. They're also not trying to force anybody into any, of the wrong shape that wouldn't be natural for them necessarily, but they are smart enough when Chuck Berry shows up with his tape recorder, this $70 tape recorder in the early 1950s money, according to him in his book, that he had demoed a couple of tracks with back at home with his band. And he does this thing for them, and they recognize the country music element right away. They decide not to mess with his sound like they would other artists, where they were trying to take someone like Little Walter and give them a hit with something like My Babe, written by Willie Dixon. Muddy Waters, Manish Boy, bum, 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 bum. That was written by Willie Dixon. Before that, he had a couple of his own songs that are fantastic. They don't have that recognizable, they're blues. It's almost, Willie Dixon practically wrote the blues stereotype you think of in your head when you think of the blues. Anyway, I don't want to go too far off track. Let's get back to Leonard Chess's stories about Chuck Berry. He said, via Alan Freed plugging, that means Alan Freed, the DJ, playing it because Leonard Chess paid him to. This emerged as a major hit and was an example of the way the Chess label contributed to the development of rock music in the 1950s with Atlantic, Imperial, and other leaders. Song plugging, is an old tradition that goes back to the early part of the 20th century. And Ed Ward writes about that in the early days of music publishing in like the 1920s, around 25 or so. Song pluggers eventually became record label people that would go bother and bribe disc jockeys one way or another to play their stuff. Alan Freed got a lot of heat for playing independent records, even though he was on the take and doing something immoral, essentially, with the money. I mean, he was giving us rock and roll with the money. I mean, he should be praised for that. He was taking chances, but he was getting paid under the table for it to do people favors. But there's more to that relationship between those three men than just, a little handshake and a little money up front. I'm going to jump over to 45 p.m., The Speed of Rock and Roll by Jim Dawson and Steve Probst. Let's see. Page 98, to be specific. Beyond the local markets, distributors and DJs around the country had to be courted and cobbled into a network ready to push your single. I just realized I didn't finish talking about the origin of song plugging. The point was, early days of song plugging eventually became payola, what's known as payola, that people ended up going to jail for. Early days was the publishing companies, not record companies, the publishing companies that would make money off of piano sheet music printing and sales, would send people into speakeasies and bars and supper clubs where there'd be live music and piano players, and they would go in, probably bribe the piano player to take the sheet music and do whatever they had to to make the quote unquote request, get the piano player to play it, and then clap wildly and loudly and cheer as loud as they could and get the other audience members to cheer after that particular song was played, so people would sort of get interested in how popular it was and go ask, what was that? And I'm going to go buy that. I'm going to go buy that sheet music so we can learn to play it at home and play it at our parties. This is what it becomes many years later. We were at, they all wanted to be in on the ground floor of a hit record, but they had to be convinced that they were betting on the right horse. Bob Rolance, who worked for Groove Records, an R&B subsidiary of RCA Victor, told writer Arnold Shaw that whenever he was releasing a new 45, he had to go hit the road. Quote, there was a northern tier of distributors, and DJs you covered, which included Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago. Also Baltimore, Washington, D.C. In Baltimore, you brought your records to Hot Rod Hulbert. You went to see him at midnight with sandwiches and coffee, and you stayed until 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. In New York, you saw Alan Freed, of course, and other guys. In the South, Atlanta was very important. You could break records on WAOK because of the Zenas Sears, partly because there was a hot distributor in the area. Atlanta was to the south what Cleveland was to the north. That's not a statement you hear very often. I don't know what that means myself. I guess he means in terms of record distribution and breaking people, on the radio. Excuse me, I lost my place. In those days, you took a record right to the disc jockey. If they liked it, they played it. If they didn't, they threw you out. You waited and sweated your time out to see the jockey. But he was the determining factor. At times, you brought the artist with you. Let's see. I don't want to neglect this next part before I get to the real Alan Freed story with Leonard Chess, because that's only part of the process here and part of the money. At the other end of the food chain, this is back to the narrative of the book, were the music publishers, the industry's 800-pound gorillas, who got their pound of flesh out of every 45 in the form of mechanical rights, a royalty of 4 cents per song in the 1950s and 60s. Out of that 4 cents, the publisher put 2 in its own considerable pocket and ostensibly passed along the other 2 pennies to the songwriters, the names in brackets under the title of the song on the label. The same deal applied to either side of the single, whether it was the hit song or the one getting a free ride on the bottom. Pause for a second. A good example of this is Queen in the 70s obviously put out a major hit called Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, on the B side of that single, of which Bohemian Rhapsody was the A side of the disc, was drummer Roger Taylor's composition, I'm in Love with My Car. Queen did not love that song, but they let Roger write it and record it for the album A Night at the Opera. And when it came time to pick a B-side, the important decision was you don't pick a song that's destined to be a hit on its own. You want that to sell its own A-side some other time further down the road. Maybe when you're on tour, you need another hit to keep more money rolling in. You don't waste that on the B-side of Bohemian Rhapsody. Well, the thing was, it is a weak song compared to other tracks on the record, but Roger Taylor is the only one who gets any credits on it, which means Roger Taylor himself, a single person in that band, raked in way more money from the sales of the Bohemian Rhapsody single because he had sole credit on the B-side, as everyone else worked together, I think, on Bohemian Rhapsody. And I know they shared some credit. I don't know if they shared it across the entire band, but definitely, you know, Freddie Mercury was the originator of the song, and a guitarist, Brian May, wrote some of the music as well. So if not all of them, at least those 2 were sharing the profits. Back to the 1950s, though, and back to the narrative of the book, the text itself. Having your name under a hit song or on its B-side was money in the bank, a windfall, a share of a skyrocketing stock, or that oil gusher. Furthermore, every time a song played on the radio, the publisher and songwriter made a couple of pennies in the performance royalties, collected by 2 companies. Here we go. Broadcast Music Incorporated, also known as BMI, and the more established American Society of Composers, Artists, and Publishers, also known as ASCAP. These are the 2 companies that control this business when it comes to the publishing, the mechanical royalties, all that stuff. They're the ones that are supposed to make sure you, the artist, and the songwriter get paid when someone buys sheet music, buys karaoke backing tracks of your song, plays your song on the radio, puts your song in a commercial, anything like that, in a movie, soundtrack, whatever. Under those conditions, songs were like nuggets of gold in an otherwise tenuous landscape, and stealing credit for them in order to collect the royalties was not uncommon. It had been going on for years. In the 1920s, the world's most popular singer, Al Jolson, recorded an original song only if the publisher made him a co-writer. During the swing era of the late 30s and 40s, band leaders commonly cut in or cut themselves in on anything composed or improvised by their musicians. And if they were major names like Goodman or Hampton, they might even cut themselves in on the songs that were brought to them. However, with the rise of rhythm and blues, rock and roll, and the rough and tumble world of hit 45s, this is why I'm bringing all this up, everybody. I'm not reading this just to fill space. Taking both the songwriting credits and the publishing became almost an industry standard. Artists who wrote their songs usually had to sign them away as a precondition to recording them. Most had little knowledge of the music's property value, and the record companies made no effort to wise them up. I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. Chuck Berry's first single, Maybelline, in 1955, offers a good example of how the business worked. The song's publisher was ARC Corporation, and the songwriters were listed on the original 45 as Berry, Fratto, Freed. ARC was owned by the same brothers, Phil and Leonard Chess, who owned Chess Records. So on top of everything else they were getting, the publisher's 2 cents for every copy of Maybelline that sold, and another penny or so from BMI whenever the song played on the radio. The Chess brothers also owned the publishing for Wee Wee Hours, the B-side of the single. Pause for a second. Wee Wee Hours on Hail Hail Rock and Roll, the concert is played with Eric Clapton on lead guitar. Check it out if you like Clapton, especially since it's a time when he was knee-deep in adult contemporary light pop rock, and now he's like getting to play some really serious blues again on this really awesome old Gibson ES350 with the P90 pickups, just like the one that Chuck Berry recorded Johnny B. Good with, I believe. Anyhow, back to the narrative. To appreciate the windfall these men received, consider that they really weren't publishers. The original music publishers from Tin Pan Alley paid their songwriters a salary and hired pluggers, that term again, to go out and hustle their songs to band leaders, record company A&R men, artists and repertoire men, radio show producers, and anyone else who could get a song started, whereas record company owners like the Chess brothers simply took the publishing rights as part of doing business and generally made no effort to push the songs to other artists beyond the hope that someone at a larger company would decide to record lucrative cover versions using legitimate pop stars, which is what would happen with Tutti Frutti by Little Richard being redone by Pat Boone. Ooh, if you ever want to dry up your partner's wet places, play that version of Tutti Frutti. If you ever want to, I'm being vulgar, I know, if you ever want to make a gentleman's turtle go back into its shell when he's in the mood for hot rock and roll action, play the not Little Richard version of Tutti Frutti. We'll get to Little Richard, by the way, too. I just ordered his autobiography, or his biography, and I've been watching his NBC-produced biofilm, which has a lot of cool stuff going for it. Back to the narrative and the taking of publishing money from the artist by Leonard Chess. Since Chuck Berry at this point was an unknown, the Chess brothers needed help in assuring his exposure, so they offered New York disc jockey Alan Freed a third of the writing credit for Maybelline, so that he could make a fraction of a penny in payola every time the song played on the radio or sold at a record store. Freed also owned half the songwriting credit on an earlier Chess Records hit, Sincerely by the Moonglows, which became a huge cover hit for the McGuire sisters. Never mind that Freed's co-ownership created a conflict of interest every time he played the single on his program. The other writer, Russ Fratto, was the landlord of the building where Chess Records was headquartered, and he also ran a print shop next door that printed the distinctive blue Chess labels. So his inclusion was a payoff of some kind. Now, Chess was not forthcoming with this information to Chuck Berry. So Chuck was surprised, having found out by looking at the label itself that he was not the only credited songwriter, and that had to be explained to him. Leonard Chess reportedly or supposedly just reassured him that that was the way they were going to get it played on the radio and move records, and it was just a thing done in business. He did not tell him that he was losing out on royalties. He only told him he was splitting the writing credits. He wouldn't find out till later how much money he was losing to these other two men that had nothing to do with his composition. In the movie Cadillac Records, let's talk about that. This scene is sort of played out with a face-to-face meeting with Alan Freed, Mos Def playing Chuck Berry, and Adrian Brody playing Leonard Chess. Yeah, I'm not going to go look up the actor who played Alan Freed. He's only in there for like a couple minutes. But he basically, having heard the track, assures them that it's going to be a hit, and he tells Chuck and Leonard, who are sitting across the table facing him, if I play this record on my show, it's going to make you very, very famous, and he points at Chuck, and him, very, very rich, pointing at Leonard Chess. And Mos Def, as Chuck Berry, gives a great little performance where he does the feigned, oh my goodness, realization, excuse me, did you say me sitting here? Hey, hang on a second. He does the hands up, like wait, like motion. Gets up, scooches Adrian Brody over into his previous seat and sits down in Leonard Chess, Adrian Brody's seat, and goes, there now. As if to say, yeah, how about you give me the money and make this jerk off famous instead? The rest of Chuck Berry's life professionally would be dedicated to making sure this never happens again. And there's some really important character traits and historical events that pop up in Cadillac Records that I think bear a little bit of scrutiny and appreciation simultaneously. One of the things Cadillac Records does really, really well, I think, is portraying Chuck Berry as the outsider of the group. At the point where he shows up in the narrative of the film, they've already established Willie Dixon as their main songwriter. They've established Muddy Waters as their main sort of hit maker at this time, but they're bringing in more talent, establishing them on the radio, on the stations they can get them played on anyway. And this includes people like Little Walter, who are a little more volatile, and they rage against the situations and the conditions that they're sort of finding themselves in, whether it's being mistreated by police, because they're black and they're mouthy and they've got attitude, and they get, Little Walter gets beat up real bad in front of everybody at Chess Records for mouthing off to the cops, and is distraught with the fact that, the other people there aren't just like rushing in to fight the cops with him essentially. And they try to like convince him to shut up and quit getting his ass beat and, pay off the cops instead. The injustice of the world he lives in drives him crazy, and he acts violently a lot. Chuck Berry, on the other hand, goes through similar injustices when it comes to how he's treated, how the business treats him, how club owners treat him. There's a fantastic scene where, and this sets the time period of the film, I think, better than the classic cars, better than the suits and the hairstyles and the hats and the height of the waistbands of the trousers. If you've watched a lot of period pieces in American 20th century films, you'll notice that the men's waistline, depending on the fashion of the day, tends to rise and fall over the decades, especially if you watch, not even American films. So even if you watch all the James Bond films, the suits, the way they're cut and the fashions move around a lot. If you watch detective stories that feature a character like Philip Marlowe, depending on who's playing him at what time, whether it's the 80s or the 50s or the 70s. Anyway, I digress. One of the things that sets up the times so well is a scene when Mos Def, playing Chuck Berry, arrives at a gig out of town, and they don't believe that he's Chuck Berry, even though he has identification. They say Chuck Berry's a country western artist, and he's a white man. He sings like a white man. And Chuck Berry points to a poster on the wall featuring a picture of, it's a printed picture. It's not a photograph of him. And he's like, that's Chuck Berry. I'm Chuck Berry. He plays his guitar in front of these men, and they still say, whoever you are, you can't play here. So he takes the poster off the wall and leaves. Before I get into the Chess Records book sort of breakdown of who they want you to perceive Chuck Berry to be, or the lasting impressions that you should have of Chuck Berry according to their narrative, this is a company that ripped him off. Obviously, this book isn't being written by the company, but it's written on behalf of the company. I would like to borrow a phrase from a very talented Irish writer named Garth Ennis. If you know, you know. And if you don't, well, you probably won't get too into his stuff, I suppose, if you're of the average middle of the road, genteel reader type person. But he was responsible for producing early 2000s and late 1990s comic book stories that became series like The Punisher, The Boys, pretty objectionable, violent stuff. But of one particularly violent, mean-spirited character in one of his stories, Preacher, the family member of that character, who happens to be our protagonist in the story, refers to him as someone who got mistreated so bad at some point in his life that he spent, I'm not directly quoting, but I'm paraphrasing. He spent the rest of his grown adult life fucking other people before they could fuck him. And that, I believe, is the main takeaway when it comes to Chuck Berry's attitude and antisocial behavior. I'm not using that in a clinical sense, but in a pop culture-y sense. People do not like him because he is not the kind of person that treats people all that well. And I think that's a product of his earlier years as a person and earlier years in the business of music. And I don't mean his family life. He had a supportive family for sure that he loved a lot. Went to prison as a teenager for trying to boost a car with a couple of friends of his. Got 10 years in prison for a first offense as a teenager. Or was it a teenager? Maybe he was 21. I'll double check that. I'll correct it. We'll get to it. There's so many books to draw from here soon. No, it was 18 years old. He was thrown in prison at 18. So he was right there on the... I mean, people at that time in America, especially in the South, I mean, they were getting married at 13 for crying out loud. So I guess they didn't see people as a minor when they were 18 back then. But it's a pretty heavy sentence for a first-time offender. Race probably had a lot to do with that. The Chess Records book by John Collis. Again, I'm very thankful I have it. I'm not trashing John Collis as a writer. But the Chuck Berry section of the book spends a lot of time making sure they want you to know you should not think well of Mr. Chuck Berry as a person. As it says, as an affable human being, Chuck Berry has no qualifications whatsoever. His lifelong fan, Keith Richards, who tangled with him in the making of Chuck's 60th birthday tribute movie, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, once made the memorable observation, I love his work, but I couldn't warm to him even if I was cremated next to him. That's a great quote. Berry seems mean-spirited and suspicious, and he has several times come into conflict with the law. Youthful robbery, transporting a minor across a state line for immoral purposes, tax evasion, installing video cameras in the women's lavatories of his country club. I think there needed to be an and somewhere in there. He would say that his insistence on being paid in advance for a gig and his habit of playing for the contracted time almost to the second before leaving is a natural reaction to being ripped off early in his career. Although by the late 50s, unlike any of his label mates, he was a comparatively wealthy man, laying out plans for his country club with its guitar-shaped pool and guest chalets. And, all right, is that a strike against him? Like he wants to save more money because he's been ripped off a lot early before he got successful? I don't know. This next part, too, kind of bewilders me. He would say that the habit of picking up unrehearsed and often intimidated musicians en route is an economic necessity, because he could not possibly afford to keep a salaried band together. He would say, with justification, that at least one of those convictions was racist in origin. And this refers back to his criminal past. So I don't know why we just had 2 paragraphs about his band leadership practices, and then we go back to criminal stuff that should have been edited into the more relevant paragraph, I suppose. But I want to touch on that. Chuck Berry figured something out that other people didn't really figure out, that like he would rather play one-off gigs than tour once he got successful enough to be able to dictate how much it costs to hire him. He would rather not keep a band rehearsed and pay them to rehearse and play shows. He would rather show up in town with a guitar case, get paid in cash in the office, and then play exactly the amount of time he was contractually obligated to, and then leave. And just depend on the band to know Chuck Berry's greatest hits, which is a story told by Bruce Springsteen in Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll. He was 23 years old and a working musician, and he found out Chuck Berry was coming to town, and he got the promoter to hire him and his friends that would eventually become sort of parts of the E Street Band to back him up. And they knew all the Chuck Berry songs. They figured they had to. Chuck didn't arrive until 5 minutes before showtime, went straight to the office with his guitar case, got paid in cash, probably like $25,000 or whatever, and then plugged into whatever amplifier was on the stage, and Bruce Springsteen at age 23 asks him, excuse me, Mr. Berry, what songs are we going to be playing tonight? And he just turned around and looked at them with his eyes wild and electric and said, boys, we're going to be playing some Chuck Berry songs. And then turned around and started playing. And it was like they just looked at their bass player who could figure out, well, depending on what fret Chuck started at, like what key the song was in, and therefore where the bass line was going to be, and therefore what song it probably was. He's done that his whole post 30-year-old life, basically. I mean, somewhere well into his, I mean, he was basically on the edge of 30 years old when he started getting real famous. So as soon as he could do that, he did that. I don't know why that's a strike against him. I know why his criminal past can be a strike against him, of course. The book does talk about the judge caused him to be thrown out because of the racist opinions that were displayed by him. It was perhaps not prudent to pick up a 14-year-old immigrant prostitute in El Paso, take her to St. Louis, and install her as a waitress in his club, although there could be no doubt the American legal system would pursue a case against a black man with greater zeal than it would a good old boy. This is all from the Chess book. In his defense, his modestly titled The Autobiography, which surprisingly proves that his remarkably pared down witty skill with a lyric does not translate to prose, does nothing to hide his turbulent, adulterous past. It is a pity that he's not a nice chap, but we're talking about a rock and roll idol, not a next-door neighbor. Yeah, book. That's true. We are. So let me gripe for a second about this presentation of Chuck Berry in your Chess Records history. All of the stuff you said is true. As far as I can tell from what I've read, why is it in your best interest to craft that narrative instead of talking about his relationship with Chess Records specifically? Is it because we want to turn attention away from the money they kind of kept out of his pockets? They did get him played on the radio. They did produce him. Yes, this is common practice for producers and record labels to keep most of the money and leave the artists twisting in the wind. It's how business was done. But the movie Cadillac Records and some of the stuff in this book tends to portray Leonard Chess as, you know, someone that doesn't deserve a lot of scrutiny for these practices. Like your racist granddad. Well, that's just how they talked back then. You know, Leonard Chess, well, he had business practices that we wouldn't see as very moral today, but it was common practice back then. In the movie, for instance, they try to make him a much more sympathetic character by saying in the narration that he had a bar that he was trying to make ends meet with, and he was working really hard, you know, hiring black musicians that other white people wouldn't hire and giving them their shot, and it was a real rough and tumble place. I forget if it's this book or my other rock and roll, Ed Ward rock and roll book, they talk about how he was selling reefer out of the cash register to, you know, really make ends meet. But the movie portrays him as like a down on his luck small business owner who just, you know, collected insurance money on his bar after it burned down while no one was in it. So it implies that he did it himself and kept the insurance money. But he had multiple businesses in the city of Chicago at the time. You know, he was running a bunch of different places, and he used all that money to put it into the Chess Records recording studio and label. Cool. I think that's great. But it's interesting that they don't want you to know that in the film. And to go back to my gripe with the Chess Records book and what the author is saying, while all factual, I love stories of exceptional people behaving exceptionally, aggressively, poorly, mistreating people, being just awful to deal with. I don't love those people for acting that way, but I love stories about people's troubles and their personality, their derangement or their quirks or their, you know, I don't relish stories of people being abused, obviously, but I relish stories that really do give you a clear picture of who this person was, how they treated other people, because it gives you clues as to why their career went the way it did at certain points. Now, the crux, I keep, you know, repeating myself, but I'm getting to it. The crux of my gripe with what the author is doing here is the reasons why he wants you to dislike Chuck Berry are rooted in the future, in the future years after Chess Records. I want to know, if he's such an asshole, then who did he treat like an asshole at Chess Records? How did he behave around Leonard Chess and other people that worked there? How did he behave to the engineers, to the secretary, to other musicians, because he didn't really seem to integrate with the whole blues crowd. He was definitely setting himself apart, and that's what made him successful. Did he even pay attention to what other people were doing besides Muddy Waters? Muddy Waters was his hero, and he said the king of the blues, and he would bow down to that altar for the rest of his life. He admired the hell out of Muddy Waters, and that's how he got in touch with Leonard Chess. After going to a bunch of Muddy's gigs, talking to him after one of them eventually, and Muddy saying, yeah, I can get you a meeting with this guy if you come up and bring some songs, and I'll vouch I'll get you in front of him. So instead of telling me from the point of view of Chess Records that Chuck Berry's a bad guy because Keith Richards can't get along with him, and he was put in jail a few times, and he's a tax evader, and he's a guy that he's a creep that videotapes women in his bathrooms, and he's not nice to other musicians that he hires. I don't care about any of that from a Chess Records perspective. I want to know what he was like to be in the room with there. Because I can read about all the other stuff everywhere else besides a book about the history of Chess Records. That was lazy. That was filler. That was a whole page worth of filler that's not helpful to understanding Chuck Berry's history at Chess Records. Now, some of you are rolling your eyes and getting cranky at me right now. I understand. I was always the one in the classroom that behaved like a good boy and was annoyed when the teacher would give us all a lecture for people that were behaving poorly and not doing what they were supposed to. I thought it was a waste of time because I was behaving myself, being quiet, doing my homework. Hated it. So I will move away from this part of my trek through the historical narrative of Chuck Berry from 7 different sources, 7 different books. So let's talk about his first sessions there. It sounds like his earliest studio date seems to be as a session guitarist behind Joe Alexander and his Cubans in 1954 at the Premier Studio in St. Louis. So not Chess. He's still down in his hometown. And he was still going by the name Chuck Berrien. So in his musician's union card, you can see the signature when you find pictures of it. If you watch the documentary, Hail, Hail, Rock and Roll, he shows it to Robbie Robertson of the band, who's interviewing him in some of the bonus material. He writes his name Chuck Berry, and then there's this tiny squiggle at the end after the Y, which is perceivable as a letter N, but also if somebody calls him on it, he could say that's just him trailing off his handwriting. It's so small. But he didn't want to use his father's name. His father was a deacon, and he knew that music he was playing would be in conflict with his father's Christian message, and he didn't want people to associate his musical output with his family necessarily at that time. So it was in 55 when he ends up meeting, let's see, Elmore James, Howlin' Wolf, and Muddy Waters in Chicago when he makes a trip up there. He goes to visit a school friend of his who had moved out of St. Louis, I think, and was living up in Chicago and wanted to introduce him to some of these heavy hitters. And now I want to digress into also some of Chuck Berry's own words. He loved these artists, especially Muddy Waters, but he also loved Elmore James. He loved all the, great blues artists at the time that he could hear on the radio, whatever's being played, around where he lived. And when he got to Chicago, he loved them as well. But I really am intrigued by his words, or I guess not intrigued. It's easy to understand. I'm impressed by his words and his narrative when he says, I liked all those blues artists, but they were playing for the neighborhood. And they were playing for the people who came from where they came from. And I wanted to play for people all over the country and all over the world. And that is why Chuck Berry's lyrical approach is so different from the blues artists at the time. He wanted to be more like Nat King Cole, who was an excellent storyteller and wrote songs that anyone from any background could probably relate to in one way or another. But they were poetry. They were really wordy. And that's what Chuck did. He told stories and he set up situations in the narrative of his lyrics that in his case, he decided to target towards young American teenagers. So he writes songs about love and boys and girls and meeting somebody special and being, he writes about cars. He writes about school. He writes about, working a crappy job and being down, sort of downtrodden, but it makes you want to dance even more when you do get to the jukebox and put your money in. And he wrote about rock and roll as rock and roll. He was one of the people to sort of create that, I don't want to say trope, but tradition. And trope's a mean-spirited word, don't you think? Comes to rock and roll. The tradition of singing songs in rock and roll about rock and roll and how great it is and how it makes you feel. I mean, like Baby That Is Rock and Roll by the Coasters is a good one. Obviously, songs about dancing and songs about a particular dancing style were coming out of like the rockabilly and the more Elvis Presley-ish era of rock and roll music. This would continue on with AC/DC. This would continue on with another one of my favorites, Super Suckers. I know not everyone's going to be into that, but they are called the greatest rock and roll band in the world for a reason. And that reason is because they gave themselves that name, the greatest rock and roll band in the world. But also, come on. Who, after AC/DC, after Chuck Berry, is so good at writing songs about rock and roll and how great it is, for crying out loud? Anyways, back to Chuck specifically. After getting set up with a meeting with Leonard Chess, as we've discussed, thanks to Talking to Muddy Waters, in 1955, on the 21st of May, he goes in to record Maybelline. The session, it was him and Johnny Johnson, who was his piano player at the Cosmopolitan Club, which, again, we'll get into the history of that, too. And they're joined at Chess Records by Jerome Green and Willie Dixon, as well as the drummer by the name of Jasper Thomas. And Willie Dixon recalls Leonard Chess. I mean, Dixon is the poet laureate of the blues, basically. The guy that wrote for so many successful artists and established what like blues lyric writing would sort of come to be known as later, but people would all copy. Everyone before him had their own style, and there's a little more variety. Willie Dixon hit on the formula that people were going to start copying, just like Chuck Berry hit on the guitar formula that everybody would have to start copying after him in rock and roll. I mean, as Jeff Skunk Baxter said, he wrote all the guitar licks for rock and roll, and you have to, like, every lead guitarist after him had to go through the Chuck Berry portal to become a rock lead guitarist. We're going to break down his style really into a few specifics based on who he says he was influenced by later. Probably not in this episode, but the next one. We get into Go Johnny Go on that one. I'm going to plug in my guitar and make you listen to some stuff. Some demos. Let's see. This part I wanted to relate to. Willie Dixon, who I just went off on a tangent about, recalls that Leonard Chess was not in Chicago at the time of the session. When he came back, Maybelline was playing on the air because we made a dub of it that quick. This is important. This is a very important detail. I'm gonna jump back to this in a second. But finishing up what Willie was saying. Oh no, that's the end of his. Is that the end of his quote? No, it's not. Chess would never get over 1,000 or 2,000 records on anybody. But when we first cut that Chuck Berry number, I think he put 10,000 on the floor at the first shot. These are the copies of the record, I believe, that have sole credit given to Chuck Berry. This is before Leonard Chess gets back from being out of town and takes it to Alan Freed. This detail is noted in another book, another account. I think it's Ed Ward's History of Rock and Roll book, if I'm not mistaken, where Chuck had sole rights to it before they figured out how popular it was going to be. This is a practice that continued for decades after this with other record labels as well. Those nice boys in a band called the Black Crowes from Georgia put out a debut album called Shake Your Moneymaker in 1990 on the Deaf American Records label, owned by a guy named Rick Rubin, who had produced hits for the Beastie Boys, and I mean, comparatively, hits for bands like Slayer, big hit for Run DMC, multiple albums of them, and would go on after 1990 to be active in producing hits by like the Red Hot Chili Peppers. I mean, there's like 10 records in 1 year, I think, he produced that were all huge on the radio time. Point is, he had nothing to do with the recording of the Black Crowes' debut album. He signed them to his label and then moved on to other things. After they sold their first, I believe it was 10,000 records, and Chris Robinson of the Black Crowes had said this in their VH1 Behind the Music special back in 1999. He said, if you have an original pressing of Shake Your Money Maker, Rick Rubin's name is nowhere on it. After we sold that first 10,000, or maybe it was 1 million, I don't care. All of a sudden, there's a credit on there that says executive producer Rick Rubin. Very, very much a parallel to this whole arrangement. Maybelline. Now, I think the author does a cool little breakdown here. The story of Maybelline is established in the first lyric couplet, in which Barry also coins a new word that perfectly establishes the mood. As I was motivating over the hill, I saw Maybelline in a Coupe de Ville. A race develops between Maybelline and the singer in his V8 Ford. And the song is the granddaddy of every car cruising song and hot rod number, the inspiration for the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean, and a stunning confirmation of a new direction for rock and roll, interweaving teenage concerns with its blues bass. It went to number 1 in the R&B chart, and Billboard gave it an award for what was then a unique achievement of featuring in its pop, R&B, and country lists. The Barry Band bolstered their sudden fame with a 101-date tour in 101 days. He put on a beautiful show in those days, says Willie Dixon. Chuck was cooking because he insisted that everybody playing with him cook with him. He was very serious about his music. Going back to Chuck's songwriting style lyrically, I mean, he did create a blueprint. I mean, people tend to musically think of him as always doing the same thing every time. And I don't believe that's really the case so much. But even though for a while, I mean, for his hit records, yeah, there's a lot of similar guitar work and similar guitar riffing. He had a lot of other songs with greater varieties of sort of musical composition and layout of the chord changes and such, but they didn't break big like his hit records did. And his hit records, lyrically, and as far as the phrasing of his vocal and his melodies, there's a lot more going on, I think, than any of his contemporaries at the time. If you listen to Maybelline, if you listen to something like Too Much Monkey Business, they're totally different. Too Much Monkey Business is just full of tongue twisters. It's an obstacle course. And if you listen to Memphis, Tennessee, you know that it's a whole story with a twist at the end, you know, like a Twilight Zone or M. Night Shyamalan twist. Only the cleverest of songwriters were doing things like that at the time, writing out stuff like the way like a song, like certain songs by the Coasters would be pretty intense lyrically because they were written by, you know, these two brothers with sort of a Jewish wit and a Jewish character creation idea for the young black men that would be reciting these lyrics. And they had distinctive personalities for each voice in that band, and they wanted them to have their own characteristic style. And, you know, there's a lot of thought by people who write songs for other people to sing at that time. Chuck Berry is head and shoulders above everybody because he is the only guy, at least that's getting any traction that we know about at the time, that is combining incredibly clever, dense, lyrical turns of phrase that he has written himself with a new guitar style, comping from earlier guitarists in blues and jazz and injecting it with a little more high-octane energy and making it danceable and on the beat, not laid back like the blues was, not hanging back behind the beat, but really insistent. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is why punk rock would come along later after rock and roll in the 70s got too big for its britches and needed to be brought back to Chuck Berry style. And he's the first like rock and roll guitar troubadour poet. And is he a scumbag for stuff he did later in life? Yes. Yes, he is. But I'm not here doing this my history of rock and roll, in film and rock and roll, to make anyone out to be a better person than they are as far as recorded history goes. I'm not making excuses for anybody. I like reading the history of people that behave badly. That's why there's a million books out there about Genghis Khan and Napoleon, all right? We don't have to sign off on people's bad behavior to appreciate our history, where our cultural roots come from. Damn it. Done. Off the soapbox now, I promise. He also established another lyrical, I I won't say tradition, it is kind of a trope, of early rock and roll that the Beach Boys would rip off. He wrote a song called Sweet Little 16, another in a pantheon of 50s rock and roll songs about underage women and how attractive they are. But the character in Sweet Little 16, as opposed to like the character in Brown Eyed Handsome Man, which he also wrote, which would become a hit for Buddy Holly as well as Chuck Berry. Brown Eyed Handsome Man is a thinly veiled sort of hero story about Chuck Berry himself. He's that guy that's so attractive that women are, he wants to be the hero that women are falling all over themselves to be with and to make excuses for and get off, convince the judge not to send him to jail. I mean, there's some real life stuff there. So it's more like a brown-skinned handsome man is the real message, but brown-eyed is more palatable, obviously, for wide audiences. It's sort of a wink and a nod. Just as the character in Johnny Be Good was originally written with the line, people passing by, they would stop and say, "Oh my, but that little colored boy can play." He changed it to "My, but that little country boy can play." He just decided he wanted a massive audience to be able to identify with the main character. But the root of that story is, down on his luck, isolated, black, guitarist makes a name for himself and conquers the world, essentially. So back to what I was saying about Brown Eyed Handsome Man, relating that to Sweet Little 16, that is the female sort of equivalent of someone so attractive that people all over are trying to be with them. Sweet Little 16, to bring this, to my Beach Boys point, is the rock and roll lyrical trope of people over here are doing it, people over here are doing it, people over there are doing it, and people all over the world are doing it. In this case, the doing it is wanting to dance with this girl who's 16 years old. That's so cool and so beautiful and dances, so hip. All the cats want to dance with Sweet Little 16. And he names all the places. Oh, the young men are so hot for her wherever she goes. Well, the Beach Boys basically do that with Surfing USA. Instead of being about a girl, it's about the art of surfing. Do you see him? Na 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 na. Da 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 da. Surfing USA. Or Chuck is da 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 da. All the cats want to dance with Sweet Little 16. And in between, you just replace 16 with surfing. And both of them are just like, everyone over here is doing it, and everyone over here is doing it. So they have a great scene in Cadillac Records where Mos Def is Chuck Berry's hearing it on the radio and goes, "Aha! Now I'm going to make some money." And he goes after the Beach Boys and he wins. I was having a conversation with my very good friend Dan Tyson, who is a musical wizard on the guitar. And I was saying, I don't know. Maybe it was parallel thinking. Maybe the Beach Boys didn't consciously do that. I don't know what their story was. I haven't read anything about the Beach Boys really yet. And he goes, yeah, that's probably true. But you can't be the guy that wrote Pet Sounds and not know enough about music to hear the Chuck Berry song and decide to steal it. You can't pretend you didn't know what you were doing when it's that much of a ripoff if you're the genius that made Pet Sounds. God damn it, Dan. Yeah, you're probably right. But I'm sure there's a Brian Wilson autobiography and a Beach Boys biography that'll explain that to me later on when I get to it. Goodness gracious. I'm having a blast right now, even with the impending heat stroke. So I want to finish up talking about Cadillac Records, the Chess Records story. The film came out in, I think, early 2000s-ish. I think it's like 2008. It does a lot of the things that the CBGB movie kind of tries to do. And I know I keep mentioning that movie. Early on when I was doing research to start this podcast, that was one of the first things I tackled and took notes on. And I keep telling everyone at the end of my episodes that episode's coming, but damn it, man, there's so many stories about CBGB that I've been absorbing, and I'm just not ready to start doing that episode yet. It's going to be multiple episodes. Anyways, there's similarities here, and I think Cadillac Records kind of does a more cohesive job of taking the venue, in this case, Chess Records, the recording studio and the business storefront, narrative from the point of view of the originator of the business, Leonard Chess, played by Adrian Brody, and, packing in all these amazing personalities that come through his life that he tries to sort of nurture and build up, but also make money off of and like hand them cars instead of a royalty statement. And then ask them to trust him and sign contracts with him. You know, it's really interesting to talk about Leonard Chess and his portrayal by Adrian Brody. They don't do anything in the construction of the film's narrative or the script or screenplay that really makes him out to be a bad guy. But they do show him cheating on his wife. They show him making excuses to his artists, but always seeming to be the guy with his heart in the right place that's making these things happen for these other people. This is a problem I had with Great Balls of Fire as well. They showed the bad behavior of Jerry Lee Lewis, but they didn't show it from either his perspective exclusively to show us how confused he was. So he's not relatable there. And they didn't show it from his young wife's perspective just to really get the impact of all the abuse she took. So either one of those would have been a much more effective narrative. And I think I feel that way about Chess Records too. It would be much more effective if it was solely from, you know, Leonard's point of view as a conflicted person who's maybe he's trying to be good, but he can't stop himself, just like some of his artists. I mean, there's men fooling around all the time. The more of these movies I watch, and the more of these books that I read, men are just always fooling around on their women, apparently, and getting away with it, and then getting confronted every now and then, but, you know, not really getting divorced over it very often, because a lot of women didn't have a choice. That's a whole other story for probably another time. I want to get into some of the more feminist aspects of, or non-feminist aspects of the telling of these tales when we get into Down on Us and The Rose, which both have a reputation for portraying Janis Joplin in a very, very crummy light. And I'll save more of this talk for that, which is also coming soon. Back to Chess Records and Chuck Berry specifically now. I like the way he is, I believe, accurately portrayed as an innovator, as a person in control of his own destiny. And he's this sort of character in between Howlin' Wolf and Little Walter. Little Walter reluctantly accepts the songs they write for him. He gets big. He can't really handle what's happening in his life. He goes off the rails with alcohol. He gets really violent. Howlin' Wolf comes in and says, you're not going to tell me what to do. You're not going to tell me how to do anything. I'm not taking your damn Cadillacs. You're going to pay me in real money. I'm not going along with the whole Chess Records. I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid, essentially, which was not a thing you would say back then. That wouldn't happen until Jim Jones in the 60s. But I am not on board with this groupthink. Chuck Berry comes in and is like, I've got my own sound. I've got my own style. I will go along with what you are putting me through right now, business-wise, and I will eventually, not that this is portrayed in the movie, but eventually he will wrestle back control and credit of his hit single away from Leonard Chess and away from, well, not Leonard Chess, excuse me, Alan Freed and whoever the fucking landlord was. The control that was given to them by Leonard Chess so that he could get rich and famous, Chuck Berry. He talks back, but he's not violent. He's not confrontational. He's clever and he's charming and he speaks very well compared to the other blues musicians. And he always has been like that. I'm not saying that in a stereotypical down low racist white guy way. Like, oh, he speaks so well for a black fellow. No, I mean for all rock and rollers and blues players of that era, whom I have listened to lots of audio, watched lots of video of. I'd say Carl Perkins is the only one, and then maybe your Roy Orbison's here and there, and that like really can go on and tell a story, and they enunciate all their words and they speak very well compared to everyone else, other than Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry is an amazing interview. He's an amazing storyteller. He's a poet. He is an orator. This man contains multitudes. He is not Jerry Lee Lewis, let's say, by comparison. Jerry Lee is Jerry Lee. And he's always in character, but he's not a character. He's always throwing away lines and just like saying things in interviews, holding a glass of whiskey and saying things like, well, Chuck and I got in a fight at those early shows. And then the interviewer would say, like, well, what'd you fight over? And like, I said I was a king of rock and roll, and he said he was. And then he proved that he was a king of rock and roll, and we didn't have any fights after that. But like, it was cool. Like, I love hearing Jerry Lee Lewis talk. but he doesn't have layers. He's always the killer. And he's always just perplexed that his shit's not selling more every day. He doesn't have he doesn't see anything from anyone else's perspective. Chuck Berry is a very considered, controlled, manipulative individual. And he has many, many lives within him. He's suffered. He's made other people suffer. He has created an empire for himself through hard work. And before he got famous, he had this unending energy to keep pushing himself. While he was in this era of getting up to Chicago for the first time and playing his tape for Chess Records and getting his first session set up, going back and forth to St. Louis and Chicago, you know what he was doing every week? He was working construction full time. He was then playing 3 nights a week at the Cosmopolitan Club in East St. Louis, and we're talking a whole night of music. So probably 4 hours worth on stage, sweating, singing, being a band leader. Then he's going to beautician school once a week to learn how to cut hair so he can be a hairdresser as well as a construction worker and a rock and roll musician. And he's tending to a wife and I believe 2 small children at that same time. 30 years old, already been in prison once, already been through things that we're going to get into in the next episode, like being thrown into the boxing ring without knowing how to box during his time behind bars, things like that. His early musical sort of explorations and his sort of finding of his own voice. I believe his portrayal in Cadillac Records does a great job of capturing the depth of his personality and his willingness to sort of play ball at that time. And unlike other artists who just went down swinging and stayed a lot more obscure, even though they had success, he put up with it as much as he could stand and then made the whole world pay in retroactively for the rest of his life. Only thing I will throw at Mos Def in the negative, as far as his portrayal of Chuck, he didn't do any work whatsoever on the voice or the speaking style of Chuck Berry. And I only know that from having watched a bunch of footage now of Chuck in interviews and talking to other musicians and things and giving direction and being a band leader. When I first saw the film, right when it came out, I was stoked. I love Chess Records. I love all their artists. I mean, when I was a teenager and my favorite heavy metal bands got really slow and simple and tried desperately to cling to whatever success they had on the radio and MTV, I gave up on heavy metal and went to the blues. I went to Chess Records. I went to Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf. I went to Etta James. I got into Robert Johnson hardcore. I got into, as I said, Chuck Berry, and I got into, the Yardbirds and whoever their influences were, listening to that early Clapton soloing and Jeff Beck soloing. It was great stuff. I say all this because with all that background and enthusiasm, I saw Cadillac Records and said, man, Mos Def was so great as Chuck Berry. I love Mos Def, and I do. He portrayed one of my favorite characters of all time in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy movie so well, Ford Prefect. And he's so cool. Mos Def is so cool. But unfortunately, to me now, watching him again portray this character of Chuck Berry, he's so cool and so empowered as an independent person and an actor and a musician. He didn't feel the need, clearly, to do any homework as far as how Chuck speaks. And he doesn't speak clearly with definition and treble in his voice and, a beginning, middle, and end to every word he says, like Chuck does. And I'm not trying to do a Chuck Berry impression here. I'm just speaking that way that I'm describing because Mos Def has sort of a mid-rangey, nasally voice delivery that is kind of smooth, and it doesn't pop. It doesn't pop when I watch Chuck Berry sort of haranguing Keith Richards in the rehearsals for some of the songs they're doing on Hail Hail Rock and Roll, and he creeps up behind him, and he after Keith Richards has screwed up this same guitar lick 4 times in a row. He's like, now if we're going to get it right, let's get it right. You know, and it's it sounds light and it sounds easy and low energy, but it's not. It's a ice pick in your back, and it's digging in when he says that to Keith Richards, who worships him. Oh, it's so tense. God. We'll get to that more later. I think we're going to have at least 2 more episodes. We got to talk Go Johnny Go in greater detail. Got to talk Hail Hail Rock and Roll in more detail. And there was also a movie called Rock, 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 which featured, I believe, at least 1 or 2 performances from Chuck Berry, but it didn't feature him as a character. So I'll probably kind of gloss over that one. I want to thank you again for being here. If you're new, which I assume a lot of people could be if they're just looking for information on Chuck Berry and they've never heard this show before, you might like the Jerry Lee Lewis episodes, and you'll probably like the Little Richard episodes that are forthcoming. If you're not into grunge era rock and roll, and you're not into punk rock, and you're not into a lot of other stuff, you know, a lot of these episodes coming out won't be good for you. Some of the episodes I've already done aren't going to be good for you, but I want to thank you for being here and taking the time to listen and join in this fantastic life story with me in one tiny part. I have so many more books to draw from and notes that I've written down. Holy smokes. We're only just talking about Chess Records right now. So hang in there. I'm going to see how many more of these I can crank out in the next 2 days before the end of the month, because that's sort of my deadline that I've set for myself, because I'm paying for the hosting. And if you don't use it, it goes nowhere. It's not like vacation days that roll over. So these should become a rapid fire. Hopefully, if you've done a search for Chuck Berry and you found this, you see Chuck Berry parts 1, 2, and 3 all in the same spot. Unlike Jerry Lee Lewis, who I did 1 and 2 in rapid succession and then put off doing part 3, which is basically coming probably after this, because the Chuck Berry and the Jerry Lee Lewis crossover stuff needs to be wrapped up too. And I will close by saying, as always, rock and roll is the best, and we are lucky to have had it for as long as we did, or as long as we will. And you are also the best, and we are lucky to have you with us for as long as we've had, and as long as we will. You definitely deserve good music. You deserve to have exciting personalities in the world creating great art that you get to enjoy. You deserve to be happy. You deserve to have fun. And I deserve an audience like you, I will say, if I'm not being too immodest. I remain ever your humble servant. See you soon.